welcome to the webinar. My name is Josh McDaniel. I work with the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, and in a few minutes I'll be introducing the speaker, Molly Hunter, and then afterwards I'll be moderating the question and answer session. But first I want to make a few quick notes and announcements. The webinar series is jointly sponsored by three organizations. It's the Joint Fire Science Program, the International Association of Wildland Fire, and the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. I put up some links to the sites there that we would like for you to check out and look at the growing amount of resources related to wildland fire research, management, and practice that you can find on all three of those sites. Advances in Fire Practice is a subsite of the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center that focuses on fire science. And that's why the Lessons Learned Center link isn't up there on front, but you can navigate through all the Lessons Learned Center sites from there. Also want to point out, make a few announcements about the different organizations. IAWF is sponsoring a conference this coming April in Seattle, the third Human Dimensions of Wildland Fire Conference. If you have the opportunity to travel to this conference, it'll be well worth it. Some of the most important issues in wildland fire are going to be covered, and they've got a great lineup of speakers coming, including a lot of international speakers, quite a few speakers from Australia coming. Also, I won't cover this in too much detail because I believe Molly Hunter is going to be speaking about this in a few minutes, but JFSP has done a complete redesign on their website and has made it much easier to navigate to and find the information that you need. And if you haven't seen some of the publications that JFSP is putting out there, they have some great syntheses and reviews of different topics, and are just doing a great job of getting information out to the field, and there's a wealth of information on that site. And Molly will be talking about some of that coming up. And then also I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the upcoming webinars that we have lined up. In February, Ann Black is going to be presenting some research that she's done on analysis of reviews from escape prescribed fires, and this is a preview of some of the work she's going to be presenting at the Human Dimensions Conference, and should be really interesting. And then in March, we have two very interesting webinars. Krista Vessel will present some work she's done looking at the role of heat stress in the work of wildland firefighters, looking specifically at its connection to near misses and accidents. And then Mark Cochran is going to present some results of a very comprehensive review he's done of the effects of fuel treatments on wildfires across the U.S. Okay, so you can register for those webinars on the Advances in Fire Practice webpage. That's part of the Lessons Learned Center suite of websites, but there's a link there. It's hard to follow that one, but if you could just Google Advances in Fire Practice, it'll take you there. Okay. All right, now real quickly, what we try to do is do a quick poll just to get a sense of the audience. So I'm going to put some questions up, and then you can respond right there on your screen, and we'll get a sense of who everybody is out there. So the first question is who is your employer? And I know this probably doesn't capture everybody, and people probably fall into different categories, but they only give me 5 options for creating the poll, so bear with us on that one. All right, I'll put that up so everybody can see it. All right, so you can see most folks are from federal land management agencies, but quite a big participation from state and local, and then some participation from NGOs, university and college representatives, and private contractors and consultants. All right, so let's try this question. So what's your connection to wildland fire? And again, I know people fall into all sorts of categories, but just which one of these best describes what you do? All right, most people have voted now. So we'll put that up. So the greatest majority of folks are firefighters or fire managers, and then there's a lot of people describe themselves as land managers, and then actually a sizable researcher component today, more than usual actually, and then quite a few folks from outreach and education as well. Okay. One more topic we have, just to sort of get in some feedback on which topics people are most interested in getting some information on, so we can line up some future webinars. All right, most people have voted. Put that up there for you to see. Okay, so thanks for that. Thanks for the information there. It looks like a lot of people are interested in fuels management, so that Mark Cochran's presentation in March will definitely be of interest, and we'll see what else we can do along that topic as well. Okay, so now on to today's webinar. First, before I introduce the speaker, I want to tell you how questions work. You can type in your questions at any time down in the questions. On some people's control panels listed as questions, and other people it's chat. But type your question in as we go along, and we'll get to it. And the speaker will, at the end of the presentation, will try to get through all the questions. Remember, Molly Hunter, the presenter, is not the researcher for these. She's sort of giving an overview of a lot of other people's research that have just submitted reports to JFSP, but she can try to answer questions as best she can. Okay, well, with that, I will go ahead and introduce the speaker. Molly Hunter is an assistant research professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. She focuses on fire ecology and management in the Southwest and teaches continuing education courses for fire management professionals. She also works with the Joint Fire Science Program on outreach and support for the Fire Science Consortium. So welcome, Molly, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So does that work? You can see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thanks, Josh. So I'll just give a quick introduction for those of you who are not familiar with the Joint Fire Science Program. The main purpose of the program is to fund research that is tailored to the needs of fire and fuels managers, and to deliver information derived from that research to managers so that they can use it to make sound decisions and when implementing their particular projects. Typically there are over 100 active projects in any given point in time, and of course new research results and products are always coming in. And as I'm sure you're all aware, with the volume of information produced from JFSP and other organizations, it can be difficult for managers and scientists to keep up with the latest research. So really the purpose of this webinar is just to highlight some of the recently completed projects that have been funded by JFSP. I'll kind of, again, just give you the highlights and show you where you could find additional information. So as Josh said, this is the recently revamped webpage of the Joint Fire Science Program, firescience.gov. And again, I'm only going to be presenting some highlights from recent research projects, but if you want more information on any of the projects, you can find it at firescience.gov. This is what the new interface looks like. And if one of the projects in particular sparks your interest and you want to get additional information, what you can do is go to this website and click on Research, which you will find at the top of the page. And that will bring you to a page that looks like this. And you can do a few different things on this page. You can either browse the list of ongoing and completed projects that are listed at the bottom of the page, or you can search for particular projects. And you can either do a general search across the whole site using any sort of keyword that you want, or researcher name or project number or anything. Or you can do an advanced search if you want to narrow your search results a little bit. So that's where you would find additional information about any of these projects. Now, on to the projects. One of the things that JFSP has been investing in recently is a series of syntheses on field treatment practices and different vegetation types in different regions throughout the country. These field treatment guides, typically they include information on things like best practices for field treatments in a given region, common effects of field treatments, and how to overcome common challenges to successfully implementing field treatments. So the latest of these guides to be published is this one, a comprehensive field treatment practices guide for mixed conifer forests, specifically those forests found in California, the Central and Southern Rockies, and the Southwest. The guide has several authors, but the lead principal investigator is Alexander Evans, who's with the Forest Guild. This particular guide includes a comprehensive review of historical conditions, past land use, natural fire regimes, impacts of altered fire regimes, and future prospects for mixed conifer forests. And it also addresses common field treatment objectives and techniques, barriers to success, and then give some examples of success stories. And the types of treatments that are examined in this guide include prescribed fire and silvicultural treatments and combinations of mechanical treatments and burning. So the authors of this guide did an exhaustive literature review on fuels treatments in mixed conifer forest, and in addition to that they interviewed several managers and experts who work in these forest types in these regions. And based on this work, several general management principles emerged, which they share towards the end of this guide, and I list those here. First of all, they highlight that mixed severity fire in particular is really a fundamental process in mixed conifer forests. Heterogeneity is also a key factor in mixed conifer forest, and one of the things that's happened with management practices in the 20th century is that forests have become more homogeneous. Fuel treatments that reduce canopy, ladder, and surface fuels are certainly appropriate in these systems. Crown and low thinning with prescribed fire in particular has proven to be effective in reducing fire hazard. They also mentioned that because mixed severity fire is a fundamental process, it is appropriate to have prescribed fire that's of high or mixed severity. But in order to do that, organizational confidence really needs to be built and fostered for successful implementation of high or mixed severity prescribed fire. And transferring knowledge from experienced practitioners near retirement to the younger generation is really key to maintaining that organizational confidence and local knowledge. And finally, they state that collaboration is not just something that is good, that makes projects more successful. It's actually something that's now a necessary component of management at large scales. So a copy of this guide is available on the JFSP website. In addition to that, there's a recording of a webinar that Dr. Evans gave on the guide, and it's available on the website of the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, which is swfireconsortium.org, listed at the bottom of this page here. Another synthesis that's recently been published is Synthesis of Knowledge of Extreme Fire Behavior, Volume 1 for managers. A second volume, intended more for fire behavior analysts, is going to be published by this group soon. And again, there are several authors to this guide, but the lead principal investigator is Paul Worth, who's currently with Weather Research and Consulting Services. So some of the general topics that are covered in this synthesis include effects of complex terrain, critical fire weather patterns, fire interactions, column or plume dynamics, spot fires, vortices, and crown fire. And for each of these topics, what the authors do is they give a general description of the phenomenon. They describe knowledge gaps, and they describe how these processes are or are not treated in fire behavior models. In this synthesis, the authors sum up the state of the science for extreme fire behavior as follows. They state that fire is three-dimensional and is not steady state, yet the tools that are available today are two-dimensional and are predominantly steady state. But they add that additional research into extreme fire behavior could result in the development of three-dimensional models. This is a very interesting synthesis that I think would be, I think most fire managers would find very useful. It's been published by the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station as a general technical report, so GTR 854. And again, a copy of the guide is available on the JFSP website. The final synthesis I'll talk about today is this one, also recently published, and it is a synthesis of knowledge on fire history and climate change. The purpose of the synthesis is to aid managers with fire decisions in the face of climate change. And the lead author and investigator for this synthesis is William Summers with George Mason University. The synthesis includes information on the state of the science for climate change and how it relates to fire regimes and ecosystems. And it ends with the progress that is expected in the field in the next decade, next several decades, and some general recommendations for managers in dealing with climate change. And the authors do give several specific recommendations for managers in dealing with climate change, but more generally, they do state that in order for managers to best be prepared for climate change, they must do several things. First, they must maintain an accessible knowledge base of developing climate science information that is applicable to fire and natural resource managers. And they must consistently apply fire regime concepts as a bridge between climate change and fire business. They must monitor fire regime indicators to quantify any change that might be occurring because of climate change. And then they must use or develop information relationships to foster sharing of fire-related climate information to fire and natural resource managers. They must adhere to short, intermediate, and long timescale categories to align information about climate change, variability, and patterns with fire information needs. And finally, they must develop or update fire history information at the local operating level to serve as a knowledge base to benchmark future change. And again, this is a very interesting and I think useful synthesis, and a copy is available on the JFSP website. Now, on to some research projects. Now, in 2007, JFSP requested proposals to investigate techniques for reestablishing native vegetation after fire in arid lands. And this is one project that has come out of that effort. Revegetating burned arid lands, identifying successful native species using trait and competition analysis. The PI for this project is Scott Abella with University of Nevada at Las Vegas. And the purpose of this project was to identify native species that might be compatible with exotic annual grasses. And that could be readily established in burned areas through planting or seeding to hopefully ultimately prevent establishment of exotic annual grasses after fires. So to do this, they conducted an experiment that involved adding seeds of exotic grasses to experimental native plant communities to test for invasibility of communities composed of plants with different functional traits. So for example, the different constructed plant communities in this photo here had some that were composed of mostly early successional species, some that were composed mostly of late successional species. The second part of the study involved planting those species deemed successful at competing with exotic grasses in a recently burned area to determine the feasibility of using those species in revegetation efforts. And both parts of this study took place in the Mojave Desert. So briefly, here are some key findings that came from this study. First of all, from the experiment, they found that the community composed mainly of native early successional forbs was most resistant to invasion by exotic annual grasses. So the graph here shows biomass of 2 exotic annual grasses that they used in the study, and what the biomass was in different constructed native plant communities. So these were communities that were composed mostly of early successional forbs, early successional grasses, early successional shrubs, late successional shrubs, or plots that had no vegetation. So what you can see from the graph is that the community that was composed mostly of the native early successional forbs had the lowest exotic annual grass biomass. So these species seem to be most resistant, creating a community most resistant to invasion. They also found that one species in particular, Sphaerelsia ambigua, was most effective in reducing brome biomass. In the field planting part of the study, they found that that same species had relatively high survival rates, 65%, which is I guess fairly good for arid systems. And that result can be seen in this table here. This represents the number of individuals for different species out of a total of 10 that survived over the course of the study. And survival was higher when plants were watered or when they received some sort of shelter. But even in the absence of those additions, survival was fairly good. If you look, let me see if I can just pull up this pointer here. If you look here, survival for the same species, Sphaerelsia ambigua, was still 50% when there was no addition of water or shelter. So this indicates that this species in particular might be a good candidate for revegetating burned areas in the Mojave Desert. This really just represents some of the information that's come out of this particular study, and again on the JFSP website you can find the full final report, and you can also find articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Another study that has recently completed takes us to the Superior National Forest in Minnesota, particularly in jack pine forests. And here scientists examined the effects of blowdown, salvage logging, and wildfire on regeneration and fuels characteristics. The lead principal investigator in this study is Sean Fravor with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. So following a blowdown event in 1999, between 2000 and 2002, the Superior National Forest conducted some field treatments, which included salvage logging. They did this in an attempt to reduce fire risk. And then following those events in 2007, the Ham Lake fire burned through much of the same area. So the various combinations of blowdown, salvage logging, and wildfire presented an opportunity to investigate the individual and the combined effects of these different disturbances. In particular, the research looked at the effects of these different disturbance combinations on subsequent wildfire severity, on vegetation response, ecosystem carbon stocks and soil mercury accumulation or loss. Oops. Okay, so some of the things that they found were that that fire effects for the three different combinations, blowdown, salvage logging, fire, I'm sorry, let me back up here. So they looked at three different combinations of disturbance when they were examining fire severity, areas that were subject to blowdown, salvage logging, and fire, areas subject to blowdown and wildfire, and areas subject to wildfire only. And they found that the effects of salvage logging on subsequent wildfire severity depended on the attribute being examined. So both of these graphs, what they're showing is the percentage of plots in different treatments that fall under different fire severity classes. So with the classes going from lower to higher fire severity in this direction. The top graph here represents tree crown severity, and the categories of severity are basically based on the level of consumption of tree needles. And the bottom graph represents forest floor severity, which is based primarily on the percentage cover of things like organic forest floor, mineral soil or blackened char soil. The black bars in the graph represent areas that had some salvage logging, and what you can see is that when you look at the tree crown severity, a relatively high percentage of the plots that had some salvage logging were classified as fairly low severity, indicating that salvage logging can reduce the effects of fire on tree crowns. But if you look at the bottom graph, it appears a higher percentage of plots with salvage logging were classified as with higher severity. And plots without any salvage logging tended to be classified with relatively low severity. And the researchers attribute this finding to the fact that soils would have been more exposed and surface fuels less compact following salvage logging, which may have allowed for a little bit higher intensity surface fire and a little bit greater effects on the soils since those soils would have been more exposed. I'm sorry, my button is a little bit jumpy. The researchers also looked at the effects of different disturbance combinations on ecosystem carbon. And the graph to the right here shows total carbon in different ecosystem pools for the different treatments. And the abbreviations down here basically stand for the different treatments. So we have control, we have blowdown only, wildfire only, blowdown followed by wildfire, blowdown followed by salvage logging followed by wildfire. And they found that salvage logging did result in fewer snags compared to all other treatments, and that's shown in this second graph from the top. The number of snags in the areas with salvage logging was much lower compared to all the other treatments. They also found that salvage logging resulted in less downwoody debris compared to areas with blowdown and fire without salvage logging. Another significant finding was that areas subject to blowdown plus fire with or without salvage logging resulted in less total ecosystem carbon compared to areas subject to fire or blowdown alone. And that can be seen at the bottom graph here. Now what this suggests is that multiple disturbance that occur in relatively short succession may have very different, very significant impacts on ecosystem carbon stocks that you don't necessarily see with a single disturbance. And again, More results from this particular study are found on the JFSP website. You can find the full final report that has all of these findings, and then in addition to that you'll find some papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. The next study also has to do with salvage logging. This study took place in northeastern California in the Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest in Ponderosa Pine. In this area, the Cone Fire, which was a stand-replacing fire, burned in 2002. And after the fire, and before the site was salvaged, 15 5-acre treatment plots were established, and salvage intensities were randomly assigned to those different plots. And the salvage intensity ranged from 0 to 100% basal area removal. And the photos here just represent some of the variability in salvage logging intensity that was applied to this study. So all those plots were then assessed for things like fuels and snags, regeneration, and understory vegetation 2, 4, 6, and 8 years after the fire. And the principal investigator for this project is Martin Ritchie with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. Oops. So regarding fuels, the study found that surface fuels increased rapidly in proportion to the amount of material left standing after the salvage harvest. And by year 8, 80% of the retained standing biomass had basically transitioned to surface fuels. And based on that, the authors developed a relatively simple model to illustrate the accumulation of 1,000-hour fuels over time, given the amount of basal area retained from the site in the salvage harvest. And that model is basically shown here in the graph to the right. The different lines here represent the amount of basal area retained in square meters per hectare, and the dark gray shaded area represents an optimum range of 1,000-hour fuel loading as defined by Brown et al. in a 2003 paper, and the light gray shaded area represents the historical range of 1,000-hour fuels for this area. So from this you can see that when most of the basal area is removed, which is represented by the lower lines here, the surface fuels remain relatively low. But when most of the basal area is retained, then the surface fuel loading quickly increases and quickly surpasses recommended levels. So what this suggests is that some salvage logging could have beneficial effects, at least from a fire hazard perspective, and that retention of, at least in this case, between about 5 and 10 square meters per hectare of basal area results in more desirable levels of 1,000-hour fuels. They also found that snag retention varied by species, with pine and fir declining rather quickly, while incense cedar snags remained relatively stable. And snags greater than 12 inches in diameter also had fairly good retention. The photos here just give some sense for how snags have fallen over time. These are photos taken of plots in 2004 and 2010. They also looked at cavity nesters, and they found that they seem to favor fir and pine trees for excavation. So this suggests that even though incense cedar snags remain standing for some time, they may not provide really suitable wildlife habitat. So the researchers suggest that in terms of protecting trees in a salvage harvest, that large white fir trees are probably the most likely to remain standing and also provide lasting wildlife habitat. In addition, the researchers found that exotic species cover and richness did not vary with salvage intensity. Native species richness also did not vary with salvage intensity. However, native species cover did. It was lowest in the unsalvaged treatment and highest in the 100% salvage logged treatment. And the researchers suggest that this could be explained by the cover of fallen logs in the unsalvaged treatment that would have inhibited any species really from establishing. And finally, they found that survival and growth of planted seedlings was not impacted by salvage logging. Natural regeneration in this particular area was very, very low, sort of across the board. And finally, the Joint Fire Science Program also invests in what they call new science initiatives, or projects that stimulate and support activities that lead to or enhance innovative ideas in a particular field. And this project, which deals with climate change, came out of that sort of initiative. It is Climate, Fire, and Carbon, Tipping Points and Landscape Vulnerability in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And this project, the lead principal investigator is Erica Smithwick with Pennsylvania State University. And for this project, the researchers asked several questions, two of which I'll address here. First, how great a change in climate and fire regime would be required to shift vegetation communities from carbon sinks to carbon sources? And second, do current projections indicate that changes in this magnitude are likely to occur in the next century? And they used the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem as a case study to explore these questions. Oops. So to do this, they used the Century Ecosystem model to simulate carbon storage under three different climate projections based on three climate scenarios and three fire regime scenarios. And those were fires occurring every 90 years, every 60 years, or every 30 years. They also developed a statistical model to relate monthly climate data to occurrence of large fires and area burned over the last few decades. They then used that statistical model to predict fire occurrence through 2100, given the three different climate scenarios that they examined. So some of their key findings were that, first of all, with a 90-year fire return interval, carbon stocks recovered following the 1988 fires before the next 90-year fire event. And you can see that here on the graph to the right. So this is showing total carbon stocks for three different fire return intervals. The fires occurring every 30 years, every 60 years, and every 90 years. And in addition, they ran the model using the historical fire regime. So the first small dip in the graph here represents the 1988 fires in Yellowstone. And you can see that under historical conditions and under the 90-year fire return interval, carbon stocks recover to pre-fire levels before the next fire. However, if you get to fire return intervals less than 90 years, to the 60 or 30 years, total carbon stocks do not recover to pre-disturbance levels before the next fire event. And total ecosystems carbon kind of steadily declines over time. Looking at fire incidence and size over the last few decades, the researchers found that both variables were quite sensitive to small increases in temperature over that time frame. They also found that fire frequency and area burned is expected to increase under future climate scenarios. And the graphs here show the expected area burned based on just one climate scenario, one projection. They break the graph up into two time periods, before and after 2050, because the researchers suggest that they had greater confidence in the projections before 2050. But also on this graph you can see the area burned in the 1988 fires and the total amount of vegetated area in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So modeling results for all the climate projections that they examined show a similar pattern, and that is that fire years that are comparable to the 1988 fires, and years really exceeding that are going to be much more frequent. And in fact, years with no large fires are going to become exceedingly rare. In addition, fire rotations become progressively shorter over the time period modeled. In fact, they become shorter than the 90-year threshold that's needed for carbon stocks to recover to pre-disturbance levels. So ultimately, this means that the future fire regime is likely to reduce the potential for the ecosystems in this landscape to store carbon, and likely it's going to have great consequences for the vegetation in those communities. So some results from this study were recently published in a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the paper has received quite a bit of attention with popular articles published in numerous outlets. And again, on the JFSP website, you'll find the final report that has all of the findings. You can also find a link to this paper and other things as well. So I hope that gives you at least a sense of some of the important and the diverse work that's being supported by the Joint Fire Science Program. And again, to learn more about these projects, go to firescience.gov. And there you can find also information on funding announcements and upcoming events. You can also find links to the regional fire science consortia up here. The consortia are charged with communicating fire science information and connecting scientists and managers in particular regions throughout the country. So I'd like to encourage you to visit that site and find the consortia that's most applicable to you. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today, and I can go ahead and turn it over to Josh to moderate any questions that there might be.
Okay, yeah, so thank you, Molly. That was interesting. That was some really interesting projects coming in out there, and what we're hoping is to have Molly come back a few times a year and sort of give updates on some of the new research coming out of JFSP, and so this is a good way of getting a quick overview of what's sort of the latest and greatest, and that's good stuff. There was the first question that came through was asking if there's going to be a recording of this webinar, and the answer to that is yes, and I'll have it up probably within an hour after the webinar, and I'll post it on the Advances in Fire Practice homepage, and I'll stick that link up there in just a second, so you can pass that on to anyone else you think that might be interested in receiving this information. Okay, so if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we have a couple, and while we're going through those, you can type yours in, and we'll get to them as quick as we can. Cody Wink asks, when is Volume 2 coming out? He says for the previous publication, and I believe that came out when you were talking about the extreme fire behavior study.
Yes, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. You'd probably best contact whoever wrote, the name is escaping me, but
Paul Worth?
Paul Worth, yeah. Originally, I think the project was to, with the project they were just going to write one volume, but they found that the topic was really just too complex to fit into one volume and decided to do two. So it was a little extra work, I think, on their part, so I don't know if they have a timeline for when the Volume 2 is going to come out.
Brian Potter just wrote in and said Volume 2 will be out hopefully next fall.
Great, thank you.
There you go. Michelle Richards wrote and asked, does JFP have a central repository into which they compile the climate change information they collect from land/fire managers?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. Data they collect from managers. You know, all of the projects that they fund that have to do with climate change are available on their website, but I don't know that they actually collect any climate, data from managers.
Okay. Well, what about, or maybe just, is there a climate change section where some of the publications and syntheses and that sort of thing have those? Has JFSP put anything specifically together dealing with climate change?
There isn't. There's not really a section specifically devoted to climate change. But I think if you go to that research link, that part of the website, and you type in climate change in a general search, you'll find all the projects that have something to do with climate change.
Right. I know that also that one study you mentioned with the sort of the syntheses on fire history and climate change. I know they spent a lot of time talking to fire managers, and so that a lot of those publications are geared with fire managers in mind. So they're research-oriented syntheses, but they have a lot of input from fire managers, I think.
Right. And in some of these projects, they might result in databases of information, and oftentimes the researchers do make that available on the JFSP website as well. Basically, whenever a researcher is uploading their final report, they have the option of also uploading anything else that has to do with the project, which could be peer-reviewed journal articles or databases or whatnot. So if the researchers have made those available, then they would be on the JFSP website. But it's just something you have to sort of search for.
Right. Michelle followed up the question. She was saying that in the presentation you said there needs to be more communication between managers and researchers to understand these climate change impacts. And there was a workshop that was done with some of the researchers working on those syntheses on fire history and climate change, and they brought in a lot of managers, and I was just there in attendance and just sort of watched and observed, and it was really interesting over about 2 or 3 days, and the managers were telling about the type of information they needed, and then were providing input on what the findings were. And it was some of those, I think, if you can find those syntheses, there's some interesting information there, I think, that would be of use, and it's not just pure research, but it is research done with trying to answer management questions for sure.
Sure.
Okay, there's a couple questions. I'll get to them. James Gadsky asks for a definition of mixed conifer.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. Again, but they do provide that in the guide. I do recall specifically that they give a pretty good definition of what they consider mixed conifer, at least for the guide. But that's not something I'm afraid I have on the top of my head.
Okay. Marjorie Brown adds that you can search climate change in the advanced search box, and I believe that's on the JFSP website. And there are, there's not, JFSP has produced quite a bit of materials on climate change, I believe. So there is some stuff there. Maybe just haven't created a dedicated clearinghouse for it yet.
Right. Yeah.
So, and Young Lu asks, what's the status of JFSP's effort in increasing capacity in data reporting and storage? So maybe, I'm not sure if I know exactly what you're asking there, but maybe is there any efforts to create more sort of metadata type sites, any sort of sharing of data across studies, that sort of thing? Is there any sort of larger?
Well, I guess I can speak to one thing that we are working on, and with each project, JFSP often asks the researchers to submit general findings, which are kind of just sort of what I presented here, sort of the bullet points of what the main take-home messages are from a study. And we are working on compiling that database. So in addition to, if you were to search the JFSP website and find a project and then find, you would be able at this point to get the final report and any products that come along with it. But hopefully also with the findings database, you'll get sort of the nuggets of, the main points of the study, so that you can get kind of the quick and dirty overview of what the study was all about.
Okay. Bill Summers wrote in, and Bill is one of the principal investigators on one of the fire history and climate change syntheses, and he wrote that the fire history and climate change also provides an online bibliographic database accessible through JFSP. This database will be periodically updated for at least the next year. Okay, so if you can on JFSP site navigate towards the fire history and climate change materials, you should be able to find that. I haven't seen that online, but that if this is a topic of interest to you, that is going to be a very comprehensive coverage of that, and so I encourage you to go find that. And Bill sent me a copy of the syntheses, and I've read through sections of it, and it's some interesting material.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bill.
All right, that is all the questions. So I will, as you see, I've put up there. Oh, let's see. I haven't put it up yet. Let me. Because this is the link right there under Incident Fire Practice. That will take you. Of course, you can't click on your screen, but if you can find your way there, that will take you to the where the recording of the webinar will be. Tim Swedberg just wrote in, and he says you can order the Extreme Fire Behavior Synthesis by emailing him, and his email address is tswedber@blm.gov. Maybe I can get that on the screen. Okay, let's see. I'll just have to type it in sort of down here on the bottom, but you'll get the idea. tswedber@blm.gov. I believe I got that right. Okay, I'll try to make it bigger. There you go. Okay. And Molly and I were talking before the webinar that we should have put a survey question up to sort of get the audience to rate which one of these studies they would like for us to go out and recruit the speakers to give a webinar on. And I didn't have time to do that before that, but that was a really good idea that Molly had, and so we'll do that for the next one. But for this one, we'll just do it informally, and if you want, you can, if there's one of these studies that you feel that we should definitely try to get the speakers in to give a webinar, let me know, and I will see what I can do. And I'll put my email address down there. No capital there. And then you can email me, and we'll see what we can do. All right, let's see. I think maybe another question. Nope. Okay, that's about it. Well, Molly, I appreciate your time. This is interesting. I think this is a good oversight of some of the cutting edge stuff coming out, and this is a good way to get a quick feel for some of the latest research coming out. And so we look forward to the next one in a few months from now.
All right, thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming, and check back with us. We have another webinar coming up in February, and hopefully we'll talk to you then. All right, thanks.